All right. As I was saying, we've been running this program since 2010, and this is the fourth workshop. And today we have two fantastic speakers, John Waldison and Josh Ephraim. This have been friends of mine for a very long time. Just for those who are new to this place, we've been fostering entrepreneurship at Berkeley for postdocs and grad students. And the goals are basically to provide entrepreneurship toolkit through on-campus workshops, collaborate with business leaders, and networking opportunities here. Traditionally, what we've been doing is if one of you wants to pitch an idea, this is friendly fire. You might find your co-founders or just get good feedback from the speakers and all participating. And these workshops wouldn't be possible without this fantastic team behind this. Radhika, Narain, Moni, Sarvesh, Jacob, Alex. He joins us usually from Brazil. He used to be a visiting scholar, but these won't happen without the support of all these members running the group. And here in the April event, we are talking about handling difficult conversations for founders and early stage employees. I've been a founder myself. I've been an employee of a startup. So I experienced a bunch of topics that are really hard for founders and employees to bring up. So I thought, let's bring some experienced folks to talk about this. But before we jump into the topic, we are always recruiting. If you want to join the executive board, please shoot an email to us, or we have an application form on the website. All right, and here let's jump into the intro to our first speaker, John Waldison. John is an entrepreneur that has spent most of his career developing diagnostic technologies for infectious diseases detection. He's the co-founder and ex-CEO of Lucira Health, which developed the first COVID-19 test cleared by the FDA for at-home use. He also co-founded Animalia Health, which was acquired, a company that leveraged next-generation sequencing for gut health assessment in pets. I know one of the participants is looking for microbiomes, I think. He might be a good person to talk. John raised $19 million from venture capitalists, co-authored $26.5 million in grants and contracts from NIH, NSF, DARPA, Gates Foundation, and BARDA, and he knows what he's doing. And co-invented 50 plus patents filed and granted in several countries across the world. And he got his PhD from Berkeley and BS from Penn State University. And our second speaker is going to be Josh Ephraim. He's a JD MBA from UC Berkeley and Associate General Counsel at Paradigm. Paradigm is an investment firm focused on supporting the crypto Web3 companies and protocols of tomorrow. Prior to joining Paradigm, he served as corporate outside counsel to venture capital funds and technology companies at Gunderson Detmer. Josh also served as an investor and managing partner at Dom Room Fund at UC Berkeley and began his career as a management consultant focused on the biotech industry. Josh earned his BA, JD, and MBA all from Cal. Welcome, Josh, and good to see you again.
Thank you. Go Bears.
All right. We will let the speaker, I'll let John go first and talk about some of the difficult conversations he had. And he also advises a bunch of startups. So I'm sure he sees all kinds of questions and concerns from founders. But I'll leave it to John here. John, it's all yours.
Thanks, Naresh. And Josh, it's great to meet you. A little bit, as Naresh said, my background comes from the diagnostic space. I started a company called Lucira Health. So I think when you have conversations, difficult conversations with employees or advisors or board members or investors, right? Like at the company level, it really starts at the culture that you're building, right? So it's ideally as a founder of a company or first early employee at a startup, you really want to start with, cultivating a culture where people can be transparent, where as a founder, as a C-suite, you not react to things that are said, and you really want to be able to have that radical candor, so to speak, that transparency, because then you can act quickly. I think where a lot of things get in the way of that is that people sometimes can become have an emotional reaction to things. And so that's really where it's really important that in the hiring process that, you're not only hiring for IQ, but you're also hiring people that have high EQs, like emotional quotient. And that's where, in grad school, EQ isn't really cultivated, right? And so like that's part of the kind of the hiring process. And if you have co-founders that maybe are reactionary to discourse or and it leads into an argument, you really want to be able to cultivate that as a person and let them know, and try to, like, you yourself either grow towards to becoming a listener and kind of embedding and leading that culture in your organization. So it's definitely everything from when there's a employee that may be causing problems within a team to having to perform a layoff or a reduction in force at your company. Like, these are all really important events that I've had to deal with, and just being able to be open-minded and transparent, and not be reactionary to what is said, and just be like welcoming. I think like a lot of the founder culture here in the Startup Valley, there's often like founder is hero mentality, and that's, I think, a lot of that is ill-placed and actually detrimental for the company. I think ideally, if you go work at an early stage startup, you really want to find founders that are humble, that you can essentially, that are going to be able to absorb the feedback that is given to them. So I'll stop there. I guess, Naresh, I'll follow your direction, or if there's particular questions, I can go into specific examples I may have encountered, or any advice that you may have as you're working with professors at UC Berkeley, or there's a couple, it sounds like there's some members of startups here, and they may have situations pop up. So I'm happy to advise that. So anyway, I'll just pause here for a second, and Naresh, let you provide any direction.
Cool. Thanks for that, John. Maybe Josh, you can go with the general spiel, and then probably we can go into some questions and take it from the founding stage to issues that come up as you run the company and build the company. Maybe, yes, we'll talk about equity and salaries, and as founders and employees also, we will get there. Josh, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about like finding a co-founder and figuring out like what responsibilities fall on each founder. A lot of times when people come to me when I was outside counsel, it would say, "Hey, I have a founder. We just met. We get along really well. We want to split the company 50-50. We're both going to like share leadership responsibilities." And that often gives me a bit of concern, John. I don't know if I don't know how, there are exceptions, so I don't know how you guys split responsibilities, but oftentimes I suggest that it's best to clearly define, let's say there's two founders. If you disagree, how is that decision made? Who's going to make that decision? Oftentimes the way to do that is, let's say economically you do want to split the company 50-50. You can change it to 51%, 49%. So that way, it's not going to economically make a huge difference, assuming you have some great outcome, or even if you don't, it's not going to make a big difference economically. But if there's a standstill disagreement, one person owns 51% of the stock of the company, one person owns 49%. So hey, this person's going to call the shot if there's a standstill. Another way to solve that is to bring in a third person. You can do that as a third co-founder. Maybe you bring in just a third board member. It doesn't have to be like your investor. It can just be someone that you and your co-founder mutually agree to bring on as a third member. But I think it's important to think of these things in advance, because it's much harder to address them once there is a disagreement than it is when this is all kind of abstract. How are we going to handle these situations in the future? So yeah, I think that's probably the brief spiel on like setting things up to make good decisions down the road.
Cool. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that that's a nice place to start. As most of the people on this event are in the idea stage or they just founded the company, one of the first questions that comes up as you bring on co-founders is like, who gets what in terms of equity? Classically, what you do is like you go to a law firm, and the law firm usually asks you how much equity each of these co-founders is getting and how much is left for the employee pool and so on. How do you, what is the right split? Because most of the people here are deep techs, which startups that are going to take a long time to bring their product to the market. Okay. And some of the co-founders might drop out. But how do you think through the process? Because about a third of the companies fail because of the team issues. That's what statistics say. So keeping that in mind, if a co-founder is going to leave, there are going to be issues. How do you talk through that in terms of distributing how much work each person is going to do and what equity is going to be given to each of these founders?
I can jump in. So obviously it's very case by case in terms of how you're going to split things based on who's doing what. Maybe it's someone's idea, so that makes them, entitled to more than another. But the question, Naresh, that you mentioned was like, who's going to be doing the work going forward is really important. I think the way that you can solve for this in part is through the vesting. So let's say you have one person that's saying, hey, I'm going to do this full time. I'm going to dedicate, let's say maybe you have two people that are saying, I'm going to do this full time, dedicating the next 5 years of my life to this company. Maybe one of them is finishing their PhD and they say, oh, that's fine. Like I'm not, my PhD only takes 5 or 10 hours a week. And so everything else is going to be the company. Maybe 6 months later, it turns out that person is spending 40 hours a week on their PhD and, 5 to 10 hours a week on the company. You want to be able to address that through, hey, you're not providing full-time services to the company. So like your original grant of half of the company, 50%, we're going to terminate that. We're going to put you on something that's more appropriate for an advisor that's spending 5 to 10 hours a week or something on the company. So vesting, I think, is really important when you have any team of people working on something. If it's just you, doesn't matter. You don't need vesting. It really just protects you against the rest of the team and someone that's not pulling their weight, essentially. So that's why vesting ultimately I think is important. Sometimes you'll have like a CEO, solo founder who's saying, hey, this company is mine. And I'm not gonna, my stock's not gonna vest over time. If I leave, the company's dead either way. So this stock is my stock. Everyone else is gonna have vesting on their stock. And it just kind of depends on like the power dynamic and how valuable that person is. Maybe John can talk a little bit about if he's willing to share about like how they set this up for his current company or maybe previous companies.
Yeah, John, I just want to throw in a couple of things into that before you take off, right? It's usually the co-founders sitting together and having this conversation about the equity split. What are the best practices? Like, is it good to have an outsider sit with you, an experienced person, and help you understand and walk you through the process, or just make the decision yourself? The equity, every co-founder feels that they need to have an equal amount or more than the other people because they think they're going to be contributing more. What are the best practices to actually execute on that? Like, is it documentation or how do you execute on that?
Yeah, so I think, to Josh's point is, what I've done with, the first company, Lucira Health, we had an equity conversation in the beginning. We actually had 4 co-founders in the beginning, but 2 of them were starting 2 separate companies. And so much like, and one of them was like kind of like a professor role where he was going to be a heavily involved advisor, but he wasn't going to be full-time on the company. So what we did, and I took in, to Josh's point, took an Excel sheet and I laid out, kind of what everyone brought to the table and then how much time they're going to be, contributing. And we laid out a kind of very, as an engineer, very formulaic of like what the contributions were and then who was going to be at the company, right? For the not only the next 4 years, but once your stock vests, you're going to be, as a founder, you're going to be there for 7 to 10 years until the company exits, ideally, if you keep growing and maturing with the company. And so that calculating for whatever 7 to 10 years, and we actually did that, and that was part of the negotiation. And we also kind of weighted like how much work had gone into it. What the third and the fourth co-founders had actually written a grant that got the company funded, and like I had spent some time at work on the company at that point, whereas my other co-founder, he actually was going to start in the company in 6 months after his PhD. So we did some retrospective weighting and we did some future weighting, along with all those condition criteria, like areas expertise that each person brought to the company. So we were quite mathematical about it. And to Naresh's point, there's a document, we shared it and we argued over it. And during that, like to your point, like we did have advisors, and this is before Berkeley Skydeck existed. So we had med device advisors that we would come in and they'd sit in the room, and as we that actually didn't work out that well for us because a lot of them had their own special interests or their own self-interest, I guess is a word. And so we just ended up like, we're just going to do it with the 4 of us in a room, and we're not going to have any like mediator. We just got to work through these issues and stuff. And we did, and it was successful. We were able to figure everything out. And that also, I think in hindsight, it was really good because everyone knew exactly what the expectation of them going forward was, what their expectation was. You're going to be in the company for the next 10 years, even though you're starting in 6 months. And that's why you're getting this chunk of equity. And so whereas like an advisor, a professor, they're going to be trailing off after 12 months once we raise funding and stuff. And so that sets the expectation for them. So we were very transparent in that. And so also like where so that worked out well. I think generally you want to have, and then from my past experiences, you want to have co-founders that kind of are equal weighted in equity, because ideally you want to work with people who are as good as, as committed as you, or as excellent, and bring that like motivation, that knowledge, right? And so I've advised companies that are like 4 founders and they split it 25% each, right? But then the 4th founder, as they work with together, the 4th founder doesn't pull his weight. And so that's where it's like, why the 3 of them are looking around, they're like, why are we giving this guy 25%? He's difficult to work with, he doesn't take feedback, he's not contributing as much. So in those cases, it's like ideally, in the best case scenario, everyone's kind of equally weighted, because then everyone's bought in the same amount. And then, but the bad case is if everyone's equally weighted, I guess it's actually good, because if someone doesn't pull their weight, then you need to, the founders look around, and then, it's very painful to cut, founder out of the company, but I've seen that happen. And the good things about doing equally weighted is that when someone's not pulling their weight, it becomes easier to chop the dead wood, because it's a huge amount of the company. So I'll pause there. And maybe Josh can chime in, because I'm sure he's had to mediate some founder difficulties. And Josh, actually, like, do you find most of the disputes occur in like the first 6 months of working together after you may have funded the company, or is they typically, have you seen later disputes occur, later on and after the company formation?
I think if the company does it well, then this type of friction will come out sooner rather than later, which is obviously much better. But yeah, sometimes these issues come out a year or two later, or after you've raised a bunch of financing, maybe founders have taken money off the table, meaning selling some of their stock in a secondary transaction to investors. And so, yeah, I've seen it in lots of different flavors, but yeah, definitely most common early on. I think also with like highly technical teams where people maybe are coming from industry or coming from academia and maybe have one foot out the door, but not two, then those people may like go back to where they, were working before. And that's when some of this like commitment stuff type stuff comes up. The other thing that I wanted to mention that I think is probably relevant for this group is the advisors, especially like professor, like academic type advisors, and compensating those folks with equity, because I think there's obviously exceptions, but it's a very common fact pattern that you give a professor like 1% of the company, or maybe even more than that. It vests over 2 years, and they don't really do anything. And they're like, they're not interested. They kind of are collecting this. And then maybe you have a relationship with that professor. So it's really hard to go back to that professor and say, hey, we're terminating your advisor agreement. Like you're not helping us. So what I'd encourage is to have smaller grants that have shorter vesting periods that you can always re-up later on. Give them a 1-year grant, kind of see if they are really contributing and invested in your company. The best case scenario is actually to get them to, put a check into your company, because then you don't need to worry about this service type thing, and just have them be an investor. And that way they're actually giving you cash. And oftentimes, and in most cases, if we're talking about professors, like that's going to be a meaningful investment for them. And if they're doing that, that really, they're putting their money where their mouth is, and they're probably going to spend time and care about what you're doing.
Yeah, great feedback on both of those. So I think documenting is important of what everybody's going to do. And I think having equal weights seems to be a good idea there, so that if somebody is not pulling the weight, the other can come and talk together and like take a decision.
And Naresh, on the documenting, I think if let's say you're starting to work with someone, I feel like it's useful this coming from a lawyer. If you're not sure that you're going to start the company and you just kind of want to start working with someone, you can still write down on a piece of paper, hey, this is how we're thinking about it. This is how we're thinking about allocating stuff. That's not going to be, enforceable in court, but most of the time this is not going to go to like some court battle. It's really just, hey, there's a dispute. Let's go back to see what we wrote down before, and that's going to help solve the argument.
Yeah, I mean, writing gives clarity of what you're going to do in the next 6 months or 1 year at least. I think you cannot think much further, but then when you take it to an advisor or somebody, they might add their own notes of these are the other things you need to be thinking about. So we'll leave that documentation topic there. We talk about professors. I think they are great assets. They are the ones in most of the deep tech cases. They did the research for years. They brought in grants. They brought it to a stage where you can spin the company out. But then that is a past. And building the company is a whole different level. And if the professor wants to be a co-founder on the company, what kind of discussions should we have? Because most of the time, these professors are not going to leave the job. Some might do that. But then if that is the case, if they're going to be keeping their professorship, they're going to spend like 3 or 4 hours, a week or a month with the company. What should that equity discussion look like? Especially in a difficult case where if the professor feels that they should have about 30 to 40% equity in the company.
Yeah, John's shaking his head. Like, I think that's going to kill the company if you're giving a professor that big of a chunk. They're not going to. That would be very, very unusual for someone like that to, take on a CEO or real management type role in the company and kind of lead it from 0 to 1.
Yeah, I think, with my experience, ideally, professors don't walk away with more than like 5% of the company, right? And 5% is like high, for example, like if the science behind the company was their idea, right? They had written grants and like they had really were an intellectual contributor. a lot of the times I feel with professorships, like grad students or postdocs coming out of labs, is there's like this power dynamic, right? The professor signs your thesis, the professor is paying you, right? And so there's this subordination. But really, when you're starting a company, you're the one that's going to be running the company, right? Like, and it's really hard to flip that dynamic as like, okay, look now, doctor, professor, you're now an advisor to me, like, and I'm going to be working on this for the next 10 years of my life. And so that can be really difficult, especially if you need a signature for your thesis to graduate, and you're still like under contract for 6 months. So to me, like in my experience, it was always best just to like have a clean cut. So like I didn't do any company operations until I got that signature from my professor. And it makes it difficult because you may not have money like for the next 6 months after that. You're trying to figure out and you fundraise, but it's like honestly the best way to do it. If you can do it, ideally you have savings that you acquired during grad school or postdoc, but you want to cut that umbilical cord. You want to like be able to be on your own and have leverage essentially to be like, look, you're going to be an advisor to my company, and I no longer work with you. And it can take time for that professor's mindset to flip, and sometimes it doesn't flip at all. I've seen Berkeley startups that the CEO still is kind of treated like they work for the professor. So I think is really important to have that clean cut when you do launch your startup.
I've seen it even with multiple professor founder teams where one of the professors, I don't know the terminology, you guys will probably laugh at me, but was a PhD student for the other professor originally, and there's still this power dynamic, even though the more junior professor is doing more of the work and kind of cares about the issues. So it's
you still see that in academic papers these days. Like with my prior professor, the alumni from his lab, add his name to the paper, and it's just this crazy like proliferation of that power dynamic carries through over generations, right?
Yeah. The other the small like legal thing is the term founder is not a legal term. So if the professor wants to be called a founder, you can give them 3% of the company and still call them a founder for the purposes of fundraising, or and I think a lot of professors have big egos, so like give them the title if they want that, but don't give them that much equity.
Yeah, maybe we're not trying to badmouth professors here. I think this is new, relatively new for academic professors to start companies, and if they see themselves as a co-founder, they might be psychologically thinking that they want that kind of equity. But from a legal standpoint, right, Josh, if it did happen where the company was founded where a professor got 25-30% and as a grad student or postdoc, two of them take the rest of it, I heard from many investors that it's a no-no for them. Recently I had a podcast conversation with Osage University partners, where they said like they don't even look at that deals because it's not good for them. So what I heard is they have to come back to the cap table and do the resplitting again. How does that process take place, Josh? Maybe you can throw in some knowledge behind that. Like, how painful is that? And maybe John can jump in afterwards. Like, how do we prevent that? Like, is there somebody else we bring into the conversation during that equity split that will help with that difficult conversation?
I think it depends on a few things, mainly how difficult the person with too much equity feels like being in this conversation, and also like how much the company is actually worth at the time that you're trying to resolve this issue. Because if they own 30% of a company that in the last financing was, and I'll just use this number because it's easy math, but was valued at $100 million, and really instead of 30, they should have 5% of the company, are you going to pay them $25 million to get that equity off the cap table? Maybe it's worth it, but it's also a little bit of an adverse incentive where you're like rewarding someone for being difficult to deal with and not pulling their weight, and they're getting early liquidity in a company where probably nobody else is. So that can be like, you're really kind of stuck in those situations. sometimes you have to bite the bullet and just say, yeah, like we're gonna reward this person for being a pain in the ass. And we just kind of want them no longer involved. That much equity, it has implications far beyond just the economics. They might be able to hold up a decision. Maybe you want to make a business decision that they don't care about. And they're not working on this. So their feelings about the company dying are going to be very different than the founders that are working on this full time. So it can be pretty tough.
Yeah, especially John mentioned, there's a power dynamic. So maybe there's an IP office that's also involved, like in IPRA at UC Berkeley. They're heavily involved in entrepreneurship. Maybe somebody there could help that conversation. But try and avoid giving such equity. I think that's the takeaway from that. Fuhar
And
has
solve it early if
Yeah.
that happens. Hopefully they're not fully vested in their 30 million. They've only vested into like a year, and so hopefully the situation's not that bad.
Yeah, Fuhar has a question. Say he's like, can early employees also be offered 0.5 to 3% equity and be called a co-founder? I guess it's nothing legally binding.
I'll give a quick legal answer.
Yeah.
You can call anyone a co-founder if you want. It seems a little weird if it's like an early employee that has that little, but you could if you wanted to.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I think I want to keep this conversation going on. The one of the other questions that comes up is hiring and firing decisions. Maybe John can jump in first about what are those difficult decisions as a team. If you have to hire somebody and two of your co-founders don't like this person and two of you like it, how does it work? And firing the same. Yeah.
Yeah. So with what we did in the early days is that when I was terrible at hiring. If two of the first 4 people I hired, I had to fire, and it was just absolute terror. It's like is just like a very bad process having to do that. So we improved our process and made our interview process much more rigorous. We had 3 stages. The first stage we interviewed just kind of more, it was more like EQ, like it was a phone call trying to understand what their technical expertise was, what their what they like, what motivates them is actually really important to know for the employees you hire. Like, are you hiring a mission driven employee, or are you hiring like a mercenary who's driven by other means? Second interview was they came in and they did a pretty rigorous technical interview. And then third interview process we had, they would come in, we'd give them a tough problem. They'd come in, they present it to the team. The team would then take them out to lunch. And that's usually because after the second phase, we knew we wanted to hire this person. So the third phase was really recruiting them. So once we switched to this process, it was a lot slower, but we did not make any mistakes. It was amazing. But when you're getting that offer, because there's a question here, how you discuss equity and salary of early stage employees, the equity is 90% of startups fail, right? So the equity is potentially meaningless, and you should keep that in mind when you're an employee or you're trying to get hired at a startup. Now, as a startup founder, I would use it to my advantage, right? Because if you're raised a seed round or a pre-seed round, you can give a lot more equity to your early stage employees than you do at a Series A company, right? Although Series A company is a little more real in terms of the equity value. So there's like levers, right? And so typically in the early stage of the company, you have to pay under market rate, right? Rarely is any early stage company paying market rate. And so usually you try to adjust that by giving more equity. And so you can always ask, what was the company valuation was, if they raised a safe, what was the valuation of the company? I've had people ask me like, what percentage of the company you were giving me? As a founder, I would try to shy away from giving the percentage of equity that I was offering them, but I would often try to convert the number of shares to the current valuation of the company, right? So I'd be like, okay, these shares are worth this amount based on our current equity. So they could see like, okay, if they're getting a $60,000 salary offer, their equity offer is $100,000, essentially in terms of shares. And so I try to be as and I would put this chart together of like, and I would offer them like three different options. Like, yeah, option one is the highest salary and lowest equity, and then option three would be, the lowest salary and the highest equity, and they could just pick whichever option, and the trade-offs of that. So I essentially allow them to make the decision, and if you're running your process correctly, then most employees that you're going to hire are going to pick the low salary and the highest equity because they're going to be bought into it and they really believe in the company. So in that terms, for example, our first employee, I would offer around 2%. Common startups is 1 to 3%. Now, if you're bringing on someone, it all depends around timing, as Josh mentioned. So like, if that person is going to be like the CTO, then you may want to like hire them, see if you can get them in the company, but eventually they may end up with like 10% or something. Because if they are, such a profound leader, they just happen to come in later into the company, you do want to give them a significant chunk of equity. But most early stage employees are, between 1 and 3, sometimes 5, if software developers can command as high, higher potentially. But it's also about you want to put a game plan together in terms of your equity projections, of your equity budget of okay, this round I'm going to be hiring 5 people, and next round I'm going to be hiring 10 people, so we're going to have 15 employees. So typically there's a rule of thumb of having an equity option pool of 15%. These days I've heard it as low as 10%, which to me is a little skimpy. But one of the things I've learned is that when a company exits 7-10 years down the road, all the employees know what equity they got. And if you're not giving them the equity they think they deserve, they're all going to hate you, right? Because everyone knows, 10 years later, how everything played out. So I always encourage startup founders to be more, err on the side of giving more equity away, because early stage, you want to have the best employees motivated, they're there working, and you want to, and if they're not that, at least being gracious in the equity amounts that you give, it'll at least give you enough heartburn that you're gonna be I need to really let this person go because they're not performing. So that's some of the benefits of giving people more equity than probably what you read online, because then it's going to force you to take action if they aren't performing. So I'll stop there. And that's kind of on both sides, but I'll let Josh chime in because I'm sure he's seen a lot as well.
From the legal perspective, mistakes and difficult conversations around hiring and firing, Josh.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, 2 interesting comments on what John said. So when you're giving those 3 options, there's some fun psychology games you can play. I think it makes sense to when you do that, it shouldn't be, let's say the stock is worth 100K at the most recent valuation. The trade-offs of the 3 choices shouldn't be direct 1-to-1, because you want to kind of signal that, hey, the equity is actually worth more than our last valuation. And so maybe if someone's picking, if you're picking the upped equity, it's not upped quite as much as the upped cash. But anyway, there's the whole psychology around that, and it's just, I think, generally good to signal, and this should be the reality is that you as the founder value the equity more than the cash. But so that was what was the other thing I was going to say? I think I forgot what the other one was.
I think that's a great point. Also, to Josh's point, you can say okay, and I don't know about the legality of this. Josh can chime in, but it's at some point, maybe I was naive, but at some point I'd be okay, if we had a $100 million exit, or a 500 million exit, or $1 billion exit, what the potential projections could be. And then I'd also disclose with dilution, if we need to get there with 2 rounds and there's 50% dilution, this is how it works out for the person. And I've heard mixed feedback, and most lawyers I think would say don't do that.
So,
but go ahead.
You reminded me the other thing I was going to say is, so let's say you've raised $50 million and the valuation is $100 million, you're going to be communicating the equity grants based on that $100 million valuation. But the reality is, if you sell the company for $50 million or less, they're getting nothing. So it's a little bit misleading because you're giving them common stock and you're talking about the price that investors paid for preferred stock, which has a liquidation preference. If I were a founder, I would do it the same way. Like, you can be transparent that there's a liquidation preference on the other people's stock, but I think you still kind of communicate it based on that valuation. They're also getting their stock for a price that is fair market value for the common stock, which is much lower than the price that the investors just paid. So let's say the investors paid $1 a share, you're often able to give your employees the common stock at like 25 cents, which looks really nice for them to be able to exercise options at that lower price. But yeah, it's slightly misleading when a founder presents the information that way. But I think it's just, as long as you're aware of that like liquidation preference that needs to be cleared to get liquidity as a common stockholder, then you can think about it that way.
Cool. Well, I have you on the mic. Maybe let's go into the firing part of it. If you decide that we need to let go of somebody, I think, how should a founder think about this from a legal point of view to cover their asses and make sure they're doing it right? What are the things that usually go wrong?
I think what goes wrong, a lot of like, I think someone said this to me and it really resonated, where like most people are like, have good judgment and are reasonable, but when you start building a company that has a large team, any large team, so like maybe it's a bell curve and the extremes are very extreme in terms of what people think is normal and what they think is appropriate for the office and all of that stuff. So people, like, if you have an organization of hundreds of people, there's going to be some people with very bad judgment in that group. And so you just need to be prepared for that. And you're going to have to make those decisions and, terminate folks. My advice really is just like, engage a lawyer when you're doing that, because there's lots of like labor and employment law is pretty complicated. If the person's in a certain state, there might be something you need to think about. If they're above a certain age, you might need to think about something. Gender, like all these things. So it's just complex. You want to get everyone to sign like a release agreement when they are terminated, meaning that they release the company of any claims they may have against the company. That's something that's going to come up in every financing or potential acquisition. So you want to be able to say, like, there's no open outstanding claims against the company because we've kind of, all the terminations have been very clean, and we've, you pay people some amount of cash to sign those agreements. Usually it's like, that's what the severance is. If you give someone severance, 2 weeks, whatever it is, that's in exchange for signing a release of claims against the company. So yeah, I think the short answer is just like, hire a legal specialist that is an expert in that those types of terminations.
One of the reasons I wanted to have Josh and John here on the show is because founders sometimes might think that, oh, I have to pay a lot of money to the lawyers. I think the amount of money you're going to pay if you mess up something without the lawyer is going to be a lot more. So just do the right thing. And then I think lawyers are your best friends. Just like a doctor, you got to tell them everything so they can clean up and help you guys. John, sorry.
Exactly. Yeah, no, definitely had a great relationship with our lawyer. So yeah, I mean, around the firing process is like really, especially early stage, maybe like 5-6 people. Like if someone's not performing, you're like, first thing you got to do is like set up like regular performance reviews. So you need to document. Like, and the thing is, like, they need feedback that they are underperforming. And if you're having one performance review for one employee out of 6 of them, it's pretty obvious that that person's underperforming and eventually being targeted, right? So then you need to apply performance reviews across the company. And it's just like so much, like HR becomes like such a headache, right? And so we used to do quarterly performance reviews. Most companies do them annually, but we did them quarterly because we're crazy. And so it was also really good because we could provide direct feedback in like almost real time to the everyone across the board of how they're performing, and it was actually well worth it in my perspective. But if someone's underperforming, you need to have you need to communicate to them that they're underperforming. That meeting needs to be documented. You need to give them time to course correct. You need to have another meeting to let them know that they aren't course correcting. There needs to be very detailed, specific documentation on this, and you need more documentation as you raise more money and become a larger company. Because you don't want any claims against the company, as Josh mentioned. So it becomes having underperforming employees is such a time burden that you really don't want that to happen. That's why we corrected and put so much effort into our hiring process. And so, yeah, and then when you have to do it, it's pretty terrible for everyone. The main key thing I would always communicate to people is like, it's not so much, it's more like it was a poor fit. And even these days, lawyers, people will advise against this, but I would be like, this was my fault. Our fault. We hired, how we went about the hiring process. It doesn't mean that you will never find an amazing job or be successful at another, position in your life. It just means that this was just a mismatch, right? It's like, it doesn't mean anything against you personally. There wasn't a match here. And so I would spend, the prior day really thinking through what I was going to say. And really empathy is really important here, because you need to understand that position, what the position of the employee is, especially if it's a small team. And what I've noticed is that in small teams, when you do remove someone who's underperforming, the rest of the team knows. It's not like they don't know. And they aren't talking about it. So, when that happens, they were grateful that we made those decisions. And so that's where it's like, if you can do it quickly, if you want to hire slow and fire fast, right? So so the first time, I think for us, I'd never done it before, and it had dragged out. And ever since, I try to act as quickly as possible. So, but yeah, that's some of my experience. But yeah, it's something you really want to avoid if you have to do it. So.
Yeah, I think, John, during a podcast conversation, for those who don't know, I had a podcast with John and his co-founder, Deb, when he said about grad school and postdoc training don't ever teach you about hiring and firing. They don't prepare you. I think you almost need a crash course with your lawyer if you're trying to found a company. I don't know if Josh has any of the law firms do that, but I highly recommend sitting down with them and please just get the lowdown and then be prepared for doing these things. Firing is going to happen. You're going to make judgment calls that are wrong. Josh,
Yeah.
any?
To be honest, I don't know if that's I don't know if you want your lawyer training you in that stuff. I think it's really a people management thing. And so, if you're a founder, you probably don't do this when your team is 5 to 10, but as you scale, maybe you're hiring an HR leader, maybe you're just, hiring your own executive coach to talk you through how to manage this type of stuff. I think the lawyer, you want, if there's a hairy situation, you just want them there to do it at the time. But yeah, a lot of this is people management where I think most people before they start a company don't have that experience. And I think it's all learnable. You see all of these founders that had never managed anyone before, and then they're the CEO of 100 or 1,000 person companies. They learn that on the job. And there's so many examples of people being able to scale and build that skill set. It's harder to build the skill sets that I think probably most of you all have. But yeah, you're not gonna know how to do all that stuff on day one.
Cool. Good point. So I want to take a slight pause and make sure participants have time to ask questions. So please feel free to type in the questions or raise your hand. Yeah, but while you're doing that, I just want to keep this going on. I want to shift the gears and talk about difficult conversations with investors. John, what were the most difficult conversations you had with investors?
Yeah, I think some of the, I mean, like, once you have investors, like it's a whole nother level, right? Like it's going from level 1 to level 10. Like you have accountability, like you need to, and the clocks click ticking in terms of the internal rate of return that they're expecting. So most of the difficult conversations I had were just with our board, and so you kind of really see people's true colors and how they react to different circumstances, and it's like a whole nother world. And so that's why when you're raising money, you try to do as much due diligence on your side as possible. You want to do references on the investors and understand, like, okay, how do they react? Are they supportive? Are they not supportive? Like, if I have asked other founders, like, okay, have they introduced, when you've like were raising money, have they introduced you to other investors, or like, so, and it's really tough dynamic. In the beginning, when I was, I guess, pretty green, I was, I was always really respectful to our investors, and it was like, and I just get completely like run over all the time. And so I think like at some point, like you probably, I mean, first you need to build a rapport with them. But it's just like, it can be difficult, right? And so they really don't understand, like if they haven't operated in a company in a while, they may not understand basic operations and the technology behind the thing and the startup and stuff. So, it's like, it can be pretty difficult. And usually this is really where, if you have co-founders on your board with you, you and your co-founder can talk things through and make sure you got 100%, you need to be on the same page. Because the more voices you have in the board meeting room, the better for you, right? So this is where politics kind of, and like politicking comes into play, right? Because if you have an independent director, you need to be engaging them regularly. You need to be on the phone with them weekly to make sure that they are up to date, and that you can like have that influence on as many people in the room as possible. Inevitably, when you have a board, there's going to be people that are just don't like you or against you, and so that's where, like, it is when you negotiate a term sheet, like how many board seats are you going to give up? Are they going to be they have board rights? Or they have board observer? All these things really matter for the long term, for your own sanity for the long term, because you're essentially being married to this person. Like it's real, like it's next to impossible to remove a board member. And I've seen it all. I've seen all sorts of terrible behavior from board members, but they're still, at the end of the day, it's still a board member, and you can't remove them. So, and I think lawyers have seen the most, right? Because they sit in and they record the minutes of the board. So, they're also probably one of the best references to ask about investor behavior. So I'll pause there.
Josh?
The one thing I'll add is just I think a lot of times founders don't think twice about giving board observer rights to folks, and they're actually somewhat costly because, and John, correct me if you disagree, but most of the time decisions at the board level are made by consensus. And it's just so let's say you have something where you as the founder disagree with kind of the investor perspective, having 1, 2, 3 extra investors in the room, even if they don't have a formal vote, can kind of shift the weight of the conversation away from what you're arguing. So I'll just be frugal in offering that up to folks as a concession to board seats. Like I think a lot of times you can be successful just entirely dropping that point when you're negotiating. So I just wouldn't consider it a win if you're like, oh, they don't have a board seat, but I wouldn't consider it a full win. Maybe it's better, but if you're compromising on an observer seat versus.
I mean, it's a great point, because we had, in the beginning, we had, it was me, my co-founder, and the investor on the board, and then we had a board observer. And so, like, it was 2 against 2 because the board observer had a voice in the room, right? And whenever the investor wanted to make a point, he'd look at the board observer and be like, "What do you think?" And the board observer was a junior to this guy, so he's terrified of him and always agreed with him, per Josh's point. So yeah, so you gotta be careful.
Yeah, you got to be careful there. I think I'm a strong proponent of having independent directors, but as long as they're well qualified, spend some time picking the right one. I think yesterday morning, Ryan Kalbeck of Circle Up had a tweet storm about that, and Ben Horowitz of A16Z is a big proponent of those as well. They're going to be your friends. They're not investing, but then they can play a balancing role when you choose the right director.
Fun
Yeah.
legal argument on independence is it someone appointed by the founders and approved by the investors, or is it someone appointed by the investors and approved by the founders, or mutually acceptable? I think there's different flavors of independent directors, and if it's someone that you can pick yourself and just get sign off from others, and that's the best case scenario.
What have you seen that works better in your experience, Josh?
I think that, if I were a founder, I'd want that, hey, this is gonna be someone that I pick and investors can sign off on, but it's not gonna be like the Sequoia guy that is like the person that they suggest for a bunch of, maybe that's not the right firm to pick on, but they have kind of a rotating group of independents that are loyal to that fund, and so they're not truly independent.
Yeah, I guess per the 100% agree with that. I was actually going to say a thing is that Josh has said about who gets to pick when you're negotiating the term sheet, who gets to pick first is a big point of leverage. To answer the question about how many advisors should a new startup have, how much equity have you given to advisor, and do advisors also stay on the board? With us, I've seen startups that had a lot of advisors. I don't know, but that's just more to me. I've always thought that's more people to manage. I've always kind of with my first company with Lucira Health in the beginning, we had 2 advisors. One was a business advisor, on how to, telling me what board minutes were and why we need to have a board meeting because I didn't understand any of this stuff. And the second was a professor at UCSF who we did our first SBIR grant with. So she was technical. So we had 2. Both of them, I think we gave about 0.5%. It usually ranges between 0.25% and 1%. And so, I think in hindsight, I probably should give them both more, right? This is why I tell people try to, err on giving them more, because they were both fantastic. They're always available to call up. Neither sat on the board, but I would be able to call them up anytime whenever I had any problems or any questions. And so we had 2, but a lot of times I see, people handing out equity to George Church to put George Church on a slide deck or whatever, right? It doesn't, and people then they'll have their, they'll have 10 advisors on their pitch deck. To me, I'm I don't know too, I'm sure there's businesses where that's beneficial. But of course, I was in a business where we weren't selling, right? We were in product development, right? So maybe other businesses where you have multiple go-to-market strategies, maybe having 10 different advisors makes sense because you have 10 different sales channels and they can help you access each of those. So it kind of is a little dependent on the business. And Josh has seen way more businesses than I have, so he could probably chime in on what he's seen.
I agree with all of that. I think the advisory board in a pitch deck is always a negative signal. And generally, if you want to put someone on your advisory board, it should be someone that's been helping the company and you're formalizing it and kind of maybe giving them this nice title, but it's not something to be promoting to your investors in a fundraise. They're not investing in your advisors, they're investing in you as the founding team.
That's a good point.
Cool. I think Fan has a question. What would you recommend allocate equity for a former advisor who's transitioning to a full-time co-founder role within the startup?
I think it depends on the role that they're taking. A full-time co-founder role within the startup. Yeah. Then, if it's full-time and they're co-founder, then would advocate for them to be, depending on how much time you had put into the startup so far. Have you raised a round? Like, what milestones have you achieved? Have you brought in significant capital in the company? If it's insignificant, I'd say almost say maybe it's fair to be close to equal, because you're both in it for the long haul moving forward.
Cool.
I
Hope
agree with
answered.
that. When I see that question, I think the fact that they're a former advisor is not really relevant. It's like, hey, we're bringing in a co-founder, and what's fair compensation for a co-founder?
Yeah, make sure there's no power dynamic for your own sake. It's equals as co-founders. Think of them that way. I think we should shift the gears to talk about employees. If some of these folks are trying to be employees at startup companies, I want to make sure we cover some ground on that. Robert has a question. Should employees have weight when deciding whether to hire a new employee?
This is excellent question. I would always say yes. In fact, when we would have like the engineering team lead hiring for them, or the assay development team, I would always be involved to make sure like there was humility, that there's EQ, that there's patience in the candidates. But each of the teams, I think, deserve to hire who they're going to be working with day in, day out. So I always encouraged, or we had the directors of each of those divisions lead hiring their teams, and their teams weren't that big. They're ranged between 3 and 10 people. So I think it's really important that the employees that are going to be working with the people have a say. And then when we did that third phase and the entire company got to meet the candidates, that was actually really helpful, because maybe someone from the regulatory was meeting an engineer, and the engineer said something weird or was skewed. Maybe the engineer just put on a face with the engineering team. We still would allow people that wouldn't work day to day with the employee to chime in if there was anything negative to come up, and we'd also consider that in the hiring process. So I think across the board, I think it is really important that employees have a say in who's going to be coming to the company. The negative there is that you can end up with a fairly homogeneous culture, right? And so then, as long as you're aware of that, and then you compensate for that. So I'll pause there.
Cool. Just from an employee point of view, maybe John, you've been a founder. Tomorrow, if you decide to go take a job at another startup, what kind of questions would you be asking them during the interview process that are of importance for you? And for anybody in general, like what should a potential employee be asking about the health of the company, financial?
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, what you're saying, I would definitely ask what the runway is, right? Is the runway 6 months, 3 months, or is it like 24? I think as a potential employee, like ideally the company gives you time to have one-on-ones, and that's what we would do too. In the second phase is you'd have 15 minutes one-on-one with other employees, and so that you can ask, what do you like about working here? What you don't like working about here? What do you think of the founders? You should be able to ask. You should be asking all these questions. How late do you work? Do you work to 5 p.m. or like 9 p.m.? What's that sort of questions.
Josh, any thoughts from you?
No, I think that covered it well.
Josh, you guys remote, or you guys have an office?
We're in person. I guess technically we're in person 3 days a week, but definitely encouraged to be in person. I think we're a team of about 60 now, and I think that's still small enough where it's really valuable to be in person, and a lot of collaboration that happens, and especially just when you're working at a startup or any kind of intense environment, it's nice to be there physically with your team, because you're kind of like going to battle every day to build something special.
Yeah, I agree
cool.
with that.
Cool. Well, one other question is bring up equity compensation. There are RSUs and all kinds of options. What is fair to ask during the interview process? I'm trying to allude to what John mentioned, or maybe Josh, that about 90% of the startups fail anyways, and then they get diluted. Investors have the priority. Again, if you were trying to get a job there, what kind of questions should somebody ask? Or in terms of bargaining, negotiating? Josh, you joined a startup.
Yeah, I think I mean, there's a bunch of things. There's like a whole, strategy. I think in terms of negotiating your comp, I think it's important once you've received an offer that as long as you're being reasonable, they're not going to pull your offer for asking for more. So, you should try to negotiate for what you believe is fair for the role. And whether that's like 10% or 20% more than the initial offer, I think it's worth pushing. And there's different levers that you can push, whether it's a signing bonus or maybe just one of the softer things you can do is say, hey, can we reevaluate my salary in 6 months? And once I prove myself that, like, let's say they're hiring you at a manager level, you think you're more of a director, just say, hey, I'll take the risk. I'll come in as a manager, but I want like a quick look at a promotion soon after. So there's a lot of different levers that you can push. And I think it's this stuff compounds over time if you're an employee at startups for your whole career. So important to push on that. And the other thing, I think economically, as an early startup employee, you're actually probably one of the taking some of the highest risk in terms of expected value. The founders own a huge chunk of the company, and they're gonna generate generational wealth if the company is extremely successful. If you're getting like 1% of the company, you're 0.5%. The company needs to have a huge outcome for that to be really meaningful, and you probably need to do that more than once in order to like retire off your equity. So you're taking a lot of risk as an early employee, and just remember that.
I think also, yeah, I agree with everything Josh said. Also, like what he said made me think about like, how fast is the company growing? Like, and like, hard tech, deep tech, that may be hard to measure, but like you do want to join a company where it is going to grow and revenue is going to grow. That means they're going to hire more people. And like one of the best things for anyone's career is to join a fast growing company, right? Even if you're, imagine being the 500th employee at Google, and now they have like 50,000 employees, right? So it's just like, even if you're, seemingly late to the game, it's just, what is the speed of acceleration there? That is really important if you can figure that out.
Ryan has a question. Are there any other red flags beyond short runway?
Tons.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of bad startups out there. One not red flag, but helpful signal, I think, is who the investors are. If there's good investors, it can be a positive, but not a like sole, hey, this great investor invested, I should go join this company. If you're, Andreessen has a big bio fund, and think about how many investments they make a year, it's a massive number, and you're only gonna make one, in multi-year. So it can be a good positive signal, but you need to be careful not to rely on some kind of external factors like that alone.
Okay.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is like, team, are you going to enjoy working there? Like, so, when talk to as many people as you can during the interview process, get a sense of the culture, and you got to be motivated, right? Like the product I always thought that the product that the company is developing gets potential prospective employees in the door. And it was really the culture that keeps them at the company for the long haul. Like during my tenure, a lot of the people I hired are still there after like 7 years. So it's just like, it was just unheard of these days. So it's like, I think it's like if you can craft it, look at the culture, and that's one of the benefits of being, early employee at a company, because you can help with hiring, you can help set that culture. So there's a lot of advantages of that. But those are all things you should be considering, because it's, it's part of your life, right? You spend, over 8 hours a day there. So
Cool. Fuhar is another question.
As an early employee, how can one convince themselves on the fact that they'll be putting a lot of efforts to make the company successful and the benefits are going to be many folds higher for the co-founder or the investors? Yeah, so I think this is I think more people are becoming aware of this these days. Yeah, I think that's why founders should be compensating early stage employees more, especially pre-seed, seed employees, that where the company hasn't raised $20 million Series A or something, like those employees should be given a lot more equity just because they should be fully bought in. And the other thing is that if you can be a leader early in the company, you can become a director, you can become a VP, may even end up potentially being part of the C-suite as a COO or something. So like in each of those promotions, you should argue like, hey, argue for salary raises, argue for more equity. I think what happens in companies is that the early stage employees, like, they put so much into the company and sometimes they never get leveled up with the new employees that are being hired in terms of the salary. So like, and that's one of the things that you can argue for in performance reviews is like, hey, I've been at this salary. We've since raised another $3 million. Like, can I get a salary bump or, can I get more equity? Like, I think having early employees ask for more equity is always like a great sign as a CEO. It means that they're bought in and they want more. So I think, don't be afraid to ask those questions.
Just a follow up on that on the other side. As a founder, how do you convince someone coming up with that question?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So just on the other side, right? Like as a founder, if your employee comes up with these questions, how do you answer that?
I think I would say, look, this has got to be, I will take that in consideration with our board. And I would say, actually, I'd say, oh shit, as a CEO, maybe I should be giving company-wide promotion or annual promotion in terms of salary adjustments or even equity bumps. I think it's really, it puts it on your radar as a CEO. And so like as the founder, if one employee comes up and asks for it, you got to assume other employees are asking for it or talking about this. So it would put it on my radar. So, okay, next time I raise or Series A or something, I need to ask for the equity pool to be raised or the option pool to be raised potentially, because we want to give maybe 2 to 5% out to all the employees to give them an equity bump. And so I'd start thinking about, okay, I need to do those projections. I need to do the equity forecasting, the budgeting, because the employees want it. I think it's as long as there's not mutiny, I think it's probably a good sign for founders running a company to share with their board that, oh, the employees are really bought in, they're asking more equity. And as an investor, they may, like my prior investors say, no, we're not giving them any more equity. But I think like that's part of your job as a founder to mediate this. And at the end of the day, you have an option pool. And so you should use it. So.
Yeah, one of the things we heard from one of the previous guests on our workshop was being transparent. Founders should be forward thinking about how they're going to bump up the salaries and equities if they raise more money, and then make everything transparent in terms of what each person is getting paid. I don't know how many people agree with that, but it seemed to be working for that startup where they know that they're being fairly compensated, that there won't be a mutiny of sorts.
Yeah, that was one of the best things that we did was put in a transparent equity scale, transparent for all the positions and seniority. And then same thing for, the current, I went out, looked at the Glassdoor, salary.com, put the market rates for all the positions and like what we were paying. So then people knew across the board, okay, what's the quality engineer being paid? What's the scientist being paid? I think that type of stuff actually gets harder as the company grows. I think it's easier when you're like 20, 40 people, like less than 40 people, because you can kind of hold people to the things. But once you start trying to like hire like VPs and stuff that have 20, 25 years experience, like it gets really difficult trying to bring people in, so it's good. We did that in the beginning, and it helped just because before we did that, I was getting so many questions about like, can I get I'd like to talk and you schedule a meeting with you, John, and then you'd schedule a meeting and they're like, I like they'd ask for a salary raise. And so it's just like, if you could set things up, we're like, okay, we're going to have an annual performance review in January. We're going to talk about salaries then and promotions and equity or whatever at that point in time. And so you could defer everything to January and just do it all at once and just kind of accept. It's like expectation management, right? Like you just need to, but you need to do it at scale across the company. And so the transparent scales allowed you to like set that up and to mitigate the side conversations until January came around.
Well, thank you so much, John and Josh. I want to be mindful of your times as well. Before we close, if there's any closing comments from John or Josh for the audience here, I think most of them are either founders or aspiring future employees of startups. Any words of wisdom for them before we close?
I'm available if they want to reach out on LinkedIn. I can happy to give my personal, or Naresh can share a personal email as people embark. I mean, you may not be embarking on this startup journey now, maybe in a year or two, but feel free to reach out as you do that, because it's always great to get multiple perspectives. So.
Yeah, likewise, feel free to reach out. Happy to help. Also, a lot of respect to those of you who are thinking about endeavoring on this journey. It's definitely a hard path, but important.
Excellent, John. Thank you, Josh. Thank you so much, and all attendees. I hope it was fun and you learned a lot as well. But we're going to be having these BPEP events once a month, the third Thursday of every month. Look out for the recording on the YouTube channel on our website. But good luck otherwise to everybody. Thank you so much. Have a good evening now.